As we celebrate 130 years of Wits Mining, we are joined by a true titan of the industry, a visionary academic and mining professional who spent over 2 decades bridging the gap between traditional grit and digital intelligence. From advising the World Bank on royalties to pioneering life-saving underground technologies, his work has consistently moved the needle towards safer, more transparent and technologically advanced mining sector. He is the former director of the Wits Mining Institute and former head of the School of Mining, and is here to share with us what it truly means to lead Africa's premier mining school into a global future. Welcome to Mining Insight. I'm your host, Matlogonolo Mashile, and thank you so much for joining us. Please remember to subscribe, like and leave us a comment. You can also financially support the channel by clicking on the Super Thanks button. This helps us to keep bringing you quality content. With that said, let's meet our guest. Professor Frederick Kerwood is a towering figure whose career serves as the definitive bridge between the deep-level traditions of South African mining and the high-tech frontier of the global industry. As a former head of the Wits School of Mining Engineering and former director of the Wits Mining Institute, he didn't just observe the digital revolution, he engineered it. From advising the World Bank on mineral policy to pioneering the Digimine laboratory, his mission has always been clear: to use intelligence and technology to drive the industry towards zero harm. He's an academic with the grit of a surveyor and the vision of a futurist. Today, we explore his 22-year legacy at the heart of Africa's premier mining institution. An absolute honor to have you, Prof. Welcome.
Thank you.
Look, let's start with your personal background and your journey into mining. I mean, outside of the work you've done, the accolades, the titles and achievements, who is Fred?
I want to say I was almost born into mining.
Sure.
I come from a mining family, third generation miner, and I grew up in the West Rand, where Goldfields mines were in the area. Although my father worked at the mine at Goldfields, we were living with the farming community and not in the mining village. So I could see both sides, the mining village aspect as well as how stakeholders like farmers perceive mining. So I started Goldfields because my dad and my grandfather worked for Goldfields. And so my dad took me to the time office, and I started in the learner official program. And my early career was as a mine surveyor. Yeah. My first job at the mine was mine onsetting, and started to progress in the mine survey section, which for me was an interesting discipline. Mine surveying is an area where mining, technology, engineering, geology, economics, it's like an intersection point for several disciplines, and I enjoyed that. And it was also at the time, that was in the early 1980s, it was also at the time when there was a technology explosion in surveying. Yeah. You know, when I started, we still did calculations with logbooks. Then all of a sudden there was an electronic calculator. We calculated areas using what we call planimeters. And then all of a sudden there was an electronic planimeter. So everything was quicker. We started using tape measurements, and then electronic distance measurements came in, and laser profiling. There was an explosion of technologies, and that really drew me in. I advanced through all the different certifications in surveying, and ended up as a section chief at the old East Driefontein mine, and it was there again the digitalization and the changes in the industry was in geostatistics. So all of a sudden we had to digitalize all sampling sheets And these were all like things that happened in the 1980s. Little did I know that we are moving towards a digital mining industry, and that was just the birth of it at the time. So that's Fred.
Sure. Look, your name, and talking about technology, your name is very synonymous with digital mining, technology, future of mining. And it's seemingly sounding very personal for you. And at the heart of it is the interest of mines working safely and achieving zero harm. Where does that intense focus, interest, and passion come from?
I must say it started from my early days as a mine surveyor at Goldfields. I was lucky, I was blessed that I was exposed to technologies very early on. I was, for example, at one stage we were sinking an auxiliary shaft, number 5B auxiliary shaft at Kloof. And it was an underground shaft, and part of the work was that we need to make sure that the equipment will fit into the underground area that we prepared for the waste chambers. And in the old days, it was like tape measurements, but that's when laser technology came onto the scene, and we did that. That was the first job that I know of, where such a big underground excavation was done through laser surveys. And this is where it started, and then, but I think the real game changer for me came with geostatistics, and then when communications became possible underground through wireless communication. And I think when I saw that what was happening on surface mines, where cell phone technology and wireless signals are already standard practice, I thought, this is it for me. I'm going to get involved with digital mining here at WITS. We discussed it at the School of Mining Engineering meeting to say, this is the future. I was still head of school then, and we need to start preparing for this future, and we're going to build this laboratory. And the real enabler is communication systems, and we're going to combine all of this to make safer mining a reality. And that's where it started.
Yeah, look, you are the champion of this digital mine project at the WITS School of Mining. Maybe talk to us about it, because you have started a bit with the leg of communication, and maybe touch on all the 4 core themes of the research project and the impact and contribution it's got to the industry.
I must say this was not an event. It was a process. I was head of school and very much involved with student issues in the school. And one of the issues students had at the time was that it was difficult for them to see underground mining excavations.
Yes.
And that's at the time we had a strong relationship with Goldfields. Mr. Nick Holland was the CEO of Goldfields at the time. I had a conversation with him, say, look, we need to give more exposure to students. Mine visits help, vacation work help, but we need something closer to the classroom. And Goldfields then gave the funding to start building what was generally known as the tunnel.
Yes.
Later we called it Nick's Tunnel, but with the tunnel in the basement of the Chamber of Mines, then the Chamber of Mines building. And it was a good space because it was a space that was not utilized. If in the university context, space is a scarce commodity. Every academic has plans for space. So it was. So we identified this underutilized space. The dean at the time was Professor Beatrice Lacay. She agreed that we can use it. Now all of a sudden we could take students from the classroom and say, this is support. This is the roof ball pattern. This is the geology that we painted on the side walls. So it started from a teaching and learning perspective. And it's the same with the stairwell in the corner of the building, where I had a discussion with Mr. Martin Hobbs from Avenge Mining at the time. And he said, Fred, we will equip it. and we will label it, and we'll put all the engineering drawings on the side so that the students can see it. So we had that, and then, but it was only when Sibanye Stillwater come on board with Mr. Neil Vroneman, when he saw this, and I gave him the plan for digital mining, because then it was a mock mine, mostly teaching and learning. But what we have done in the meantime, we invited technology companies to install their systems. So those were the things that you couldn't see, but they were there. So, and they were started, and we used wireless communications to transmit the data to the control room, and Mr. Neil Vroneman liked the idea. He's a bit of a computer and a technology. He likes it very much, and it's possibly an understatement. Yes. But he supported it, and he said, "Righto, we'll go." And the funding that he provided really took it to the next level. And all of a sudden, we no longer have a mock mine, but we have a full living digital mining laboratory with students working in it. Undergraduate students can see it, postgraduates do their research, they access the information, and it became a really exciting space after that involvement. So it was partnership. Like in mining, you know, in mining education, mining research, partnerships are not optional, it's foundational. Without it, you will not succeed, because the university resources are not enough to do these things.
Look, part of the work that you worked on, very passionate about, it's creating distance, you know, between people, machinery, and also communication. And one of the things you worked on, and I remember hearing you about 8 years ago, is a missing person locator, right? And you look at it now, Prof, that it's only recently being a regulatory mandate. Is our industry tech adoption rate dangerously lagging?
I am going to answer that question. That's a big question.
Sure.
I still haven't answered your themes. I'm just going to quickly go into the themes.
Let's go to the themes,
My apologies.
Yeah.
But the themes are important to understand the missing person locator.
For sure.
So when we started the laboratory, we thought from a research perspective, what makes a digital mine possible? And it was, firstly, was the communications, the ability to communicate in real time. That's a game changer. And then the other thing is to do it without wires. So it's wireless communication. It's already standard practice on surface, but how can it work underground? So that was the first theme, using wireless communication methods to signals for communication, but also to see if we can use give more jobs to the same signal. Like, for example, finding people after a disaster. So, and this is the kind of research that started, and with in collaboration with the School of Electrical Engineering, who supplied us with some very clever postgraduate students to do that. The next theme was survey and mapping, and the reason for that theme was, if we want to make people safe, we need to know where they are, we need to know where's equipment, we need to know where is risk, and we need to know what's the proximity of people to risk. So if we can do those, and then if we have our communication in theme 1, we can start putting distance between people and risk. So that was that theme. The third theme had to deal with security, health and safety. So that is where ventilation monitoring and rock engineering and vibration monitoring, and this came in that, but also the reality of South African mines, security issues with camera research that we did in partnership with IBM. So to take all of that, and the objective there was monitoring, whether it's monitoring air quality or rock movement, or people in a video image, but that's monitoring. And then the fourth theme was to put everything together. Sure. And the space that we did that in was the control room. And but the control room was just a space for postgraduates to sit and access the information that was transmitted there from all the systems. The ultimate objective was to put the control room in the pocket through a cell phone. So that it's the control room was for wow, because whoever walked into this said, wow, this is amazing. But the wow part is actually putting that information on a cell phone, on a decision maker underground. And that's the four themes, and they are all connected to mine safety.
For sure.
And then now coming to the missing person locator.
Yes.
The missing person locator taught us lessons. We don't have a solution yet, but we have learned so many lessons out of that. We had a very good student, an electrical engineering student. Unfortunately, he passed away about 5 years ago, who worked on this. His name was God Knows. And he worked on it. And at some stage, he came to me and said, Prof, he knows about a research group in Germany. And they are actually giving what they are doing, what you are asking me to do, because we want more jobs for the signal.
Yes.
And he has seen some publications of a technology that can find people after a rockfall. And I said, okay, we want that. And I contacted the supervisor of that laboratory, that research laboratory, got the student, and invited them, the student for 3 months, to work with God Knows, and then his supervisor, and she came for a week. And so they all worked on that. And when they were here, we did some tests, and we actually found a technology that can do what we wanted. Using wireless communication signals to locate a person, if that person had the right technology on him or her, to find that person, and maybe to, in that window of time where the person is still alive, that we can still make a difference. And so we developed it, the technology, with its Bremen University in Germany, and then we sat with it. And now that's where the implementation part comes in. To implement technology at a university in South Africa is actually very difficult.
Sure.
And it was never the aim of Digimon. It was not what we, although it's very nice and we wanted to do that, but that was not what Digimon was about. Digimon was about helping postgraduates to get data so that they can do their research, so that they don't say, Prof, I don't have data. And so that they can graduate, and that's what it was about, to support postgraduate students. But now we sat with this technology, and it was not the only technology, there was also the underground drone at the time, which was a first at that stage. And so we thought, we recognized the commercial opportunity, and I started looking for funding. But that is now funding outside our normal sponsorship. The university doesn't have the resources to sponsor these students, and putting these agreements together take time. Funding, the intellectual property, who will get what after it has been built, and all of that takes time. In the meantime, we cannot provide a viable research career for the student who worked on it. And that person is at the start of his or her career. That person wants some security at that stage. They want a job. And we cannot provide that, because our job is to develop people. When they graduate, they move on. We take the next person and we develop that person. That's our operation. And so then that time lag caused the students to move on and find other job. Both God Knows and the person who was a computer scientist working on the drone, they found employment. When the external technology fraternity heard what they were working on, they got good jobs, and when finally we got the funding to take it further, they were no longer interested, so we lost momentum. And that is the hurdle from a university perspective. And that's why we need better funding. We need stronger partnerships where we need government policy to come on board, because if we want international students, we see the benefit. They bring knowledge, but the visa requirements make it difficult. So we need the whole system to work if we want these special things, and if we want to use students as the labor component for that. Then we need the system to work, and that we couldn't get right. So the missing person locator ended up in a box. I think the box will still be down there, but the box is meaningful because a technology is not of much help without a human who understands that technology. And sadly, in the case of the missing person locator, God knows has passed on. And the person in Germany, it will be very hard for us to attract a person like that into.
So how would you then describe the current relationship between academic research and ground level implementation? I'm thinking just around, is there current technologies that are now in the shelves that should actually be at the mines as we speak? So we don't have to wait for a disaster to start moving with speed. Is there something the mines should be implementing already? And what's the relationship between research and ground level implementation?
I think the first thing to get right are the partnerships.
For sure.
We now have Mandela Mining Precinct, who's set up for this kind of partnership. So that is good. We did not have it at the time. When it comes to students, remember what DigiMine, the laboratory was. It was a laboratory where we actually took technologies that already existed above the ground and worked on them and gave them a job underground. And that was what we have done. So the concepts have already been developed. So everything that we do on surface is possible underground. We can make GPS work underground. So and there are already research programs, strong programs on that. As a matter of fact, I visited the coal mine in China where they already use GPS-based positioning underground. So it comes from the satellites outside, and then through technology and antennas it goes. So into the workplaces. So this is already happening. But at the university level, remember our operational model. Our job is to develop talent. Industry's job is to develop professionals. The work of Mandela Mining Precinct is to develop researchers. So that is where we need to take a student and say, this student has worked on a promising technology, it has commercialization potential. We need to be able to pass that student on to an institution like the Mandela Mining Precinct, and they then work on that further, and then they take it through, because ultimately our core business, although we would like to do that, and it will sound very nice from a university perspective to do this, our job is really to develop people. We mustn't lose sight of that.
For sure. While we want to embrace technology, right, and I'm talking these advanced tech, where do we draw the line? And I'm starting to thinking of, your chip in the brain or human brain enhancements. Should there be red tapes when it comes to adopting this technology in mind, and what should even inform those boundaries?
I don't want to say too much about that because I have an opinion. My opinion is we need to ask ourselves first the question. If we are able to do that, should we? And then we must take it from there.
Sure.
So then that will sort out the ethical issues and all of that. But from a mining sector perspective, and it follows on to our previous point, there is this perception that mining companies are reluctant to adopt new technology. My experience is very different.
For sure.
When whoever I approached, if you speak to the right people, they are interested. It starts with a conversation of why should we do it. But when the conversation is finished, the question is, how do we implement this? So, and that tells me you need to, when we speak to industry leaders, they have one language. They have value at the center of their mind. And if you cannot, as a researcher, explain that value, then there will be an obstacle. Yes. But as soon as they understand that value, they support, and that's my experience, and I think that is the secret. But to get back to the initial thing about if we can do it, should we? I think we need to. That's a fine line. It's good in the medical research. Here am I. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I had the old type hearing aids. Yes. And I was in the conversation, but parts of the conversation I was not part of it. Now the newest hearing aids are digital. It changed my life. I am now a full member of the conversation. So, and this is the benefit of enhancement. So I'm part human, part digital because of that. And where these technologies are used to help people, for sure, and do not affect their humanity, of course we must do it. But when it comes to mining, we need to know that there are people working with these technologies. And if we advance technology faster than what we advance people, we create risk, not progress. So that is the question. That's where we need to wait until the development comes first and that kind of thing, because the mining is human-centered, it's not technology-centered.
For sure. I want to touch as well on the work you've done and talking about resource nationalism. Right, you've co-authored 2 World Bank books, right? And I want to draw lessons on that to see if, looking at South African mining industry and the government, are we seeing equitable share and benefits of our minerals? How is the trade-off looking? How do you assess the fairness between the trade-offs with government and our investors? It gets topical in our country.
I think I must first explain how I landed into
the World Bank.
When I left Goldfields, I joined the inspectorate. Yes. And I worked in the government mining engineer's office, and my job was on the economic side to negotiate mining leases and things like that. And I worked with, at that time, we didn't have a standard royalty for the country. So we kind of looked at the economics, and then we developed a royalty scheme out of the economics. And that's where the interest in mineral law and policy started for me. Now, when it comes to resource nationalism, I do not see it. It's possibly political. It is. Look, politicians will make everything political, but I don't really see it as a political issue. For sure. I see it as a benefit issue, as a matter of understanding economic rents. Now, the textbook definition for economic rents is like profits over and above. All the costs are paid, and there's a reasonable return for the investor. So then now there's some money left over. Now the question is, what do you do with that money? And how do you engineer a system so that there's fair distribution of these rents? And let's change the terminology from rents to benefit, because this is what people understand. And now you say, but there are all these stakeholders. There's the investor, the mining company, there's government, there's communities, there's workers, and there's sustainable development issues. There are just so many, there's such a competition for these benefit. How do you distribute? And that's where your royalty formula and your other schemes then come in. And From a South African perspective, I think we have a really good distribution model, the way it is. I think the royalty is unique to South Africa, and it really does collect economic rents. And we can do more with that, and so we can tweak it further and to do more with that, so to give a fairer distribution. Yeah. So now to come back to politicians and the politics. So having that in mind, my view is we have to come back to the fundamentals.
For sure.
We need to understand, and when it comes to politics, the two main stakeholders is government and industry. Yeah. Government has legitimate claims. Minerals are national assets. Minerals are depleting. As we mine them, they are gone for good. The minerals, if there are rents or benefit, it must be distributed further than the mining company. So it must be shared. It must be used for national development. Yes. So these are all legitimate arguments. Companies, on the other hand, say, look, there's a lot of risk in mining this. They have legitimate concerns. It is difficult to mine. Profit is not guaranteed. We're going through different cycles. You know, so all these, all legitimate. And that's where we need to find a common vision of not only who gets what. That is the secondary question. Sure. The first is the common vision to say, how do we maximize value around all of this? Because this is in all of our interest. In the community, it's in all. So we need to get that value equation right. And if we have the value equation right, we no longer compete for a bigger slice of a smaller pie. And that is the answer. So we need to go back to fundamentals here and get rid of some of the political noise.
Yes. Look, let's reflect on your journey at Wits. You spent about 22 years at the Wits School of Mining. What would you describe as your highlight in this journey?
Okay. The Wits School of Mines, or affectionately Wits Mining.
Yes.
It does not need any introduction.
For sure.
And it does not need any individual to make it better. It has a strong identity of its own. It's been around for 130 years. It is not only part of the mining industry, it's part of South Africa's history, because the school was established in 1896 as the Kimberley School of Mines after the diamond rush of the 1800s. And then when gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand, it moved to Johannesburg in 1904. And so there is this long history. So it's almost like Wits Mining was built over generations. So, and each head of school that came in had to deal with different issues. Some focused on academic rigor, industry partnerships, VAC work for students. There were issues at their time, and they dealt with it. So it was layered progress over time. Each head adding a little bit to it. I think no individual person can claim, because there was a constant factor, and that is the production of high caliber graduates. Through all of that, all those, that had nothing to do with the heads of schools.
Yes.
That was the institution. So in my time, and it actually started with my predecessor, the late Professor Hugh Phillips. During his time, the country there were some changes. I joined the school in 1999. In 1999, there were 19 final year students, 19. They were almost all white male. We had some black students then, and we had some females, but they were in the minority. And then this access to education opened with the new South Africa, and we all of a sudden the program started to grow.
Yeah.
We grew from, I think the first year we had 19 final years. I think we had something like 36 first year students in that year. And then that grew to over 100 in a short space of time. So in a very short space of time, the transformation happened. The transformation was real, it was necessary, and it was needed, and it was urgent.
Yes.
We had to deal with it. And universities were not geared for this change. All of a sudden, we had a program which was predominantly white to become predominantly black.
Yes.
We had almost no female students, and in my time, 36%. I understood from Dr. Liu that we are now at 50 female students. We all of a sudden had a new situation that many of our students was the first in their families to attend a university like Wits University. They had no idea what it took to succeed at a university like Wits with all the challenging environment in Johannesburg and all of that. So they did not have the resources to support them for successful studies. And that was my reality that I had to deal with. The groundwork was laid by Professor Phillips because the school, that transformation started already. But I came with this and I thought, oh, how are we going to, because now we have all these students with all these problems. We never had a situation where we had to look for VAC work for students because most of the students had bursaries from mining companies. Now we have a situation where students were sleeping in the basement and in the libraries and they didn't have food. And it is in that moment that I realized the value of partnership. So my first conversation was with Mr. Nick Holland from Goldfields. And you know, these mining CEOs are the toughest of the tough.
Yes.
And what struck me was not only their leadership when I met with him first and later with Mr. Neil Vroneman from Stillwater, is how close, how human they are.
Yes.
Because they just open funding for this purpose. And all of a sudden, students who had no place to stay had a place to sleep. They could go to a rest somewhere. We had a food scheme in the school, so no mining student went hungry. We could buy books, textbooks, drawing equipment, what they needed from the fund. So they were all of a sudden, it was possible for them to start succeeding in the program. And these are the kind of stuff, and that drew me in. And I think that was my little contribution. And then later on, maybe the digital mining laboratory and program.
Yeah, and also your 50 publications and 44 conference papers, all to your name. What's your reflection on this outstanding academic record?
I don't see it as extent. I think for me, it was just a commitment of knowledge that I had, that I shared. And it was necessary to share them at the time.
For sure.
Most of those publications had to deal with understanding the transition in South Africa, where with the new mineral laws and policies coming in with BEE requirements, the royalty regime, to just write and explain it. There was nothing groundbreaking about those publications, but it was just an honest account of what is happening in the mineral law and policy space within the mining industry.
Sure, you are part of this massive history of 130 years at Wits. When you look at a Wits mining graduate, what is it that they have that makes them so different from the rest of the world?
I listened to your interview with Maketi Tema.
Yes.
Who, by the way, was SMES chairman when I was head of school.
Sure.
So, and he said something very interesting, and it is so true. He said that South African mining engineers operate in really difficult places. And I think if you look at WITS graduates, they have that ability. Because we are operating in a resource-constrained area. We have so many socio-political issues. We have so many demands on mining companies coming that are non-mining, that used to be called soft issues. We have all these issues, and I think WITS graduates have the engineering grounding, but they also have the humanity part of them to make them responsible leaders. And I think that is part of that. We need to be careful if we go in a more technology-intensive environment that we don't lose that. And I think the WITS program is well geared. It's got all those components in good engineering fundamentals, understanding the South African context, and then the ability to adapt and be flexible when we are dealt with very real South African mining issues, because we have these very challenging environments and mines and also environments within mining that mining companies operate in.
What does an engineer then look like in 2040? Are we still looking at hard-headed or that strong person behind data dashboard?
We mustn't get carried away by the digital. The world of work is changing.
For sure.
The world of work is changing. There are big changes in the workplace. There's strong performers in the old system that are no longer such strong performers in the new system because of the technology changes. There's concerns about workplace viability. So there are all these issues that are happening. There are all these breadwinners who were in traditional jobs, and they need to find new jobs in the new digital mining space. So my thinking is that the future mining engineer will not be defined by either hard hat or a dashboard.
Sure.
It will be their ability to lead through change, and their flexibility to do almost the impossible in challenging environments. I think that is where we need to continue nurture the generations of thinkers that we have done over time, and then we will get it right. And that will define the future mining engineer.
Prof, what message do you have for mining engineers across the globe in industries from WITS and those from other institutions who are listening to you?
If I may,
yes.
I'm not going to speak about mining engineers because
sure.
I want to speak about what's close to my heart.
Sure.
My advice to academics, mining engineering academics, like in the school of WITS Mining here, is to start looking at what they can do better in their lecturing program. We have already a very busy program, and it's very hard to add more stuff. And it's tempting to add more digital stuff because it's nice. The young people want to see it. But we need to start looking at curriculum modernization and teaching and learning in a different way. And I do think artificial intelligence is here to help us. My advice to academics is to go and understand large language models. Because it's very different from the ChatGPTs.
Yes.
It's not. You can go into ChatGPT. You can ask questions about the mining value chain. It will give you quick answers. It will give you nice flowery explanations, but not so much substance.
Sure.
Lecturers have that substance in lecturing material. So the secret is to move away from PowerPoints into LLMs. Because if you can build a proper AI on fundamentals and good information, then students have a personal tutor whenever they need it, wherever they need it. And it's not only students, it's also users of AI in mining companies. But you can't do it through general AI. You have to create what we call domain-specific AI models, which is on the mining value chain and nothing outside the mining value chain, and it honors the pattern of the mining value chain. Then these things and that becomes part of your lecture material. So I don't see a tension here. AI will not replace academics. What AI will do, it will change how we see good lecturers, because good lecturers will have this additional tutor that will help students.
Look, Prof, thank you so much for your insights and really for serving the school with so much passion, and the work you continue to do even outside your retirement. Truly appreciated.
Thank you very much.
A century and 30 years of excellence. If today's conversation is anything to go by, the best is still to come. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye and God bless.